Well, good. Um, Now, I've talked to Constance about this book. She said she's had a hard time getting through it, and I'm so sorry that I'm such a theology nerd. But there were so many things. There's so many things about this book that interest me. Number one, the fact that it is a book by Zora Neale Hurston, who almost was lost to obscurity apart from the um, rediscovery. And I can never remember if it was uh, Alice Walker or if it was Toni Morrison. I think it was Alice
Alice
Walker.
Walker.
Yeah, who rediscovered or discovered for the first time some of her work. Member of the Harlem Renaissance, and but also one of the early anthropologists uh, studying at Columbia University under a man named Franz Boas, who really is is foundational for anthropology, and was on that cutting edge in the 1930s. And so uh, she's written fiction, she's written nonfiction. If you ever want to have a really interesting read, you can read about her study of voodoo in Haiti. Uh, and the Dominican Republic, which was really good. But this one, interestingly, she chose King Herod, and her interest in the Jews is not something that I've been able to really pinpoint. Why? Because she did not grow up around Jews. The only thing I can imagine is that the woman who funded her education to attend Howard University had a very, you know, obviously Jewish name. And I don't know if that's where her interest in this came from. She certainly had a association and affiliation with the church early on in her life. I don't know about later on in her life, but it was one, as we've seen, it was one of her lifelong interests to write a new history of the Jews. And this book was meant to be just one chapter in that. And if you were going to think about all the people you would want to write about in the Jewish tradition, King Herod the Great would not be one of them, right? We know about Herod mostly through our reading of scripture. It was Herod is the one who calls for the wise men to come and see when this new child has been born, this King of the Jews. He's also the one in Matthew reputed to have been, to gone through the streets of can't remember where it was, but it was Bethlehem, and killing all the firstborn children, uh, uh, killing all the male children who were 2 years or younger. But we don't have any. There's no historical evidence that either of those two things ever happened. They're certainly part of a tradition that is reflective of the story of Moses, actually, the child who is the redeemer of his people coming out of adversity. And so, Matthew especially is trying to have his readers see Jesus in the light of Moses. The last time when we met, I just gave you a quick background on about the 500 years that preceded Herod, coming out of the Babylonian captivity. There was this brief period of time, which is very complex, and I won't be able to remember all the names, but the Hasmonean dynasty from about, well, actually, it begins probably closer to 163 with the Maccabean revolt, but from 140 to 137, the Jews in and around Jerusalem and Judea had relative peace and prosperity. All of the great powers were being, you know, I guess their attention was being drawn away by the rise of the Romans, and so tiny little Judea didn't really fall under anybody's real interest. And so the Hasmoneans established themselves as a Jewish kind of royal court, and they reigned for roughly about 100 years. And the idea is that they would be both king and high priest. The person who was the high priest was the king. So talk about your theocracy. That's where we get it. So a lot of this is nice backstory, but not really as important to us until we get to one of the descendants of these Hasmoneans. And by the way, Hurston refers to them as Asamoneans with an A-S-A M-O-N-E-A-N-S, I think is how she spells it. But they claimed, a kind of a royal legitimacy and heritage to be the rulers over what by the time of Herod's birth is quite a large kingdom. And you see this little orange area down here around Jerusalem. That's what it looked like about 140. But the Hasmoneans, like many empire hungry people, expanded their empire and included an area down to the south here called Idumea, forced people to become Jewish. And out of that forced conversion came the family of Herod, Antipas, and then Antipater, and then Herod. And so that's where our story picks up. We have in Jerusalem, around 47 BCE, there is a high priest there by the name of Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus. He, by this time, has survived usurpation by his brother, if I've got my timeline correct there. By the way, the Hasmoneans really, they were always fighting with each other, and they didn't show themselves to be followers of the law that much. But Hyrcanus is the high priest, and by 47, because of the conflicts that have been happening with the Hasmoneans, the Romans appointed the father of Herod, Antipater, to be the procurator of Jerusalem. And he was able to really kind of put things in order. But Antipater saw that his connections were very, very important. He was an Idumean, but he married a woman, Cypros, who was a Nabatean, and by Nabatean we mean Arab aristocrat. And so he's making political connections. Think about the Kennedy family. That's about the best image I can give you. But he is going to be Antipater is going to be such a friend and advisor to Hyrcanus that he almost becomes indispensable. Well, he becomes indispensable in the day-to-day affairs of Jerusalem, and wanting to make his family all the more politically connected, he makes associations with the Romans. So we've got associations with the Arabs, the Nabateans. We have association with his Idumean families in the south, and he is also ingratiating himself to the Romans, who are, embroiled in conflicts of their own. But he is Jewish, and so he is able, Antipater, the father of Herod, is able to claim, some legitimacy in the role that he has. And that's kind of where we left off last time. I just wondered you had any questions, because I'll pick up with John Hyrcanus II, and where our book picks up as well.
Dan?
Go ahead, Denny.
Just a quick note on possibly Hurston's motive to write this book. I think she was really taken with the Exodus story out of Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, moving into the Arabian Peninsula thousands of years ago, and being the early people of the Exodus, and seeing the Jews also as the Exodus out of Africa, if you will, under the slave trade. As an anthropologist, I think she was fascinated with this whole coming together of two stories.
That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about that, and I haven't read enough of her work to know, but I didn't know anything about her biography that would lead her to want to write. And you come to think of it, you're probably right, to kind of rewrite the history of the Jews from the African perspective. That makes a lot of sense, Denny. I appreciate that very much. Any other comments? Thanks. Well, this is what Herod's kingdom looked like in 47 when he was, this is what the Jewish kingdom looked like in 47 when Herod was appointed as the governor of Galilee. Now, I think it's really interesting. You may have heard in the news, I was looking for a reference for it. I had one last week, but lost track of it. But there are many in Israel now on the right-wing Zionists who want to rename, these areas and bring them back to their first century names, Galilee and Judea, at least, maybe not Samaria. They weren't big on Samaria. Has anyone heard anything about that recently? It may come to pass, but now with
Well,
this,
Dan,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm old enough to remember when I think it was Menachem Begin
Yeah.
back then, and Denny can certainly check me on this, but the tradition was to refer to Israel as Judea and Samaria.
Oh, really?
Yes,
I did not know that. Tell me more. And that
Indeed.
would have been the 60s.
or before.
Okay.
And that was the drive to finally, after the 6 Day War, to take over the West Bank, because that is where the true, in their eyes, in terms of
Yeah.
Zionist scholars,
Yeah.
that's where the true Israel really resided.
And okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I see that. I was not aware of that. But that proposal is being brought up again, returning to Judea and Samaria. And I thought Galilee was part of it as well, but I may be wrong.
And this is also fueled right now by the extreme right wing cabinet members in Bibi Netanyahu's government.
Right.
Really want to see this happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I'm referring to. That's where that's coming from. But then I looked for the article that I was reading and could not find it at all. But our story opens up in 47 BCE, and Antipater is the procurator, and Herod is going to be appointed as governor by his father, and thus by the Romans, as governor of Galilee. Then his older brother Phasaelus is going to be appointed as governor of Jerusalem and Judea. And it's shortly after this that there's a group of Jewish elders who are meeting with Hyrcanus, and those elders are called the Sanhedrin. You might remember from the gospel, the Sanhedrin. I'm looking at chapter 1 of our book right now, which I should probably take out of my backpack for just kind of going by memory. But you might remember that Sanhedrin was that religious court of judges that Jesus appeared before, before his execution. They didn't have the power to execute him, so they sent him on, to the Roman procurator. The same kind of structure that we're talking about here. But the Sanhedrin are kind of somewhat bemused by this idea that Herod was going to become the governor of Galilee, and absolutely certain that he would go to Galilee and meet his death there, primarily because Galilee was a backwater. At this time, there is a revolutionary, well, you would call it, it's just basically called a robber, just robbing people, killing people, by the name of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah had developed quite a reputation, pretty much kind of like the drug lords of Colombia or South America, developed quite a reputation, living in obscurity, descending upon villages, killing people and robbing. And the Sanhedrin, especially some of the Jews who are jealous of Herod, are absolutely convinced that Herod is going to go up there and meet his death. And of course, we know that does not happen. But it's good to remember some of the differences between Judea in the south, where Jerusalem is, and Galilee in the north, because these are going to certainly carry over into the time of Jesus. Judea saw themselves as a little bit more sophisticated religiously. There's racially, there's far more diversity in Galilee, and geographically, of course, there is this separation. Judea is further in the south, and does not have the soil and the rainfall that Galilee does. So Galilee is really quite an economically productive area, and some of the people of Judea are somewhat jealous of the money that some of their country cousins up north have been able to procure just out of their work as in agronomy and agriculture. Culturally, because of the diversity, Galilee speaks a kind of language that can be easily distinguished. It's an accent. Just like if you hear somebody from my part of the country talk, you know exactly where they're from, right? By the words that they use, by their idiomatic expressions and things like that. And we see this in the Bible when people are asking Peter, at Jesus' arrest, or well, you're a Galilean. It's like, how do you know I'm a Galilean? Well, that's a question we ask. How do they know he's a Galilean? Because he talks like a Galilean, right? This is Aramaic that has been influenced by the wealth of languages being spoken in that area. In Judea, it was still Aramaic, but it was inflected differently. And of course, religiously, because of the diversity, Galilee is seen as an area that is a little bit less focused on, covenant responsibility, as we see from Jesus, right? The people of the south of Judea looked upon the people of Galilee as being entirely incapable of keeping covenant regulations. Their hands are dirty all the time. So they kind of look down their nose at them. So when Herod gets appointed as governor of Galilee, it's not exactly a plum of an appointment from the perspective of the Jews. And you can tell what their attitude is in chapter 1 of this book, when they say, well, yeah, he's a nice looking fella, good 25-year-old, tall, and Hurston really makes him out to be this Adonis type of figure. Very, very brash and bold and self-confident. And he goes to Galilee, and it's not long before he finds himself, in battle with Hezekiah, and routes him out, kills him without any, due process of the law. And that kind of sets up the first dilemma of the narrative right here. So any questions or comments about that? Hopefully you're all in that place in the book. I'm sure you are. Also want to go ahead, Denny.
Certain parts in chapter 1 that struck me as kind of a combination of Don Corleone
Yeah.
and Godfather. Take no prisoners meets Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it seems to me Zora Hurston really wanted in the end, was the sequel to, the sequel to that great body of Super CinemaScope Bible epics.
Yeah. And even the language, the dialogue in this reads like a screenplay. But you're right. And in fact, there's one of the articles that we read that said that, this was the 1950s and 60s where Cecil B. DeMille was making these huge, 10 Commandments and she tried as best she could to get this story produced as as a movie, but there were no takers on this. And but you're right. Yeah, it does have a lot of that aspect to it, right? Did anybody find the dialogue a little stilted, or maybe that's not the right word, just little oh gosh,
Well,
what's
it's
the right word? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
corny.
Corny. Well, no, I didn't want to say it that way, but just false, just
melodramatic.
melodramatic. Yeah, very much so. Uh, but that's Hurston writing for the cinema, right? Because that sounds just like the stuff that you would have heard in, Cecil B. DeMille. So you kind of wonder, gosh, maybe they should have shaped this up a little bit. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is to give us a fair representation of what Hurston was writing, instead of offering a story that is going to be, acceptable to our 21st century ears. There's something else I wanted to point out about Herod here and his father and their political connections. They are in the thick of it when it comes to their association with the Romans. When Herod does go to Galilee, one of the places he goes immediately is to Damascus, and where the cousin of Julius Caesar is residing and, is the overseer of that area. I don't know exactly what his title was, but his name is Sextus Severus, Caesar Sextus Severus. And when Herod goes up to Damascus, and confers with Sextus, he runs across a young man by the name of Nicholas, Nicolaus. You might remember that in the text. This Nicholas is studying this newfangled discipline called history, And so after Herod has his little conference with Sextus, he goes and visits this friend of his he's very close to. I mean, they grew up together. Well, Nicholas would be the biographer of Herod. And it was probably the work of Nicholas as well as Josephus. Josephus would come nearly 100 years later. But Josephus probably used the work of Nicholas in, getting an understanding of who Herod was. So it's important that Hurston makes Nicholas a part of this story as well, because we would know nothing about Herod. We would know nothing about the court intrigues. We would know nothing about, some of the more picayune details of, the administration between, Herod and the Romans, were it not for Nicholas. And, you always have to, remember that Nicholas was not writing history as we know it. He was not accounting for facts and details. Those play a role, but one of the roles that Nicholas played was to lionize Herod. And so it's this lionization that Hurston is picking up on. So, but Damascus, it's not on this map. There's another player in this story that's important to know about, and it's the Parthians. The Parthians are a group of nomadic warriors that live in Iran, just the other side, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and they're always making inroads into this area that we know of. It is referred to as the Levant. The reason that Sextus Severus is in Damascus is to try to, make sure that the Roman Empire is saved or is secure against that Parthian invasion, because there's a lot about this area that is very important to Rome. It is an agricultural area, and it's also a place that's going to provide a lot of fish. The Sea of Galilee. There's a place in the book, you may remember it, where Herod is reflecting on what's going on in Galilee, and he says, "Yeah, we've got this new industrial fishing, with this new fishing operation that's doing quite well in Galilee." And that was true. This would have been about the time that the Romans had said, "Hey, dried fish from this great big lake here, the Sea of Galilee, would be really helpful for us to transport over to Rome." These fishermen would be the fishermen from whom Jesus would choose his disciples. They were going to be the ones working for the man, so to speak. Well, at the time, Sextus, the Roman, I guess he's the procurator of Damascus. I can't remember his exact title, but he's always keeping in mind what's happening with the Parthians. To get into a little bit of court intrigue here, John Hyrcanus, who is the high priest, has a nephew by the name of Aristobulus, who briefly tries to take over his high priesthood. And that nephew is supported in that endeavor by the Parthians. So the reason I'm bringing up the Parthians, or maybe is when we studied the book of Revelation, you might remember the story of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. A lot of the imagery that's used in terms of the battles that take place in the book of Revelation, and the scourge of military battles that were about to take place, are reflections on, or and I guess influenced by what people knew of the Parthians. Apparently they were quite ruthless and always had their hands in this area. So there are so many players in this that we don't often hear about. But the Parthians are the ones that are the predecessors of the current day Iranians, right? I think we've already gone over, but remember, the Sanhedrin is kind of the religious authority. That consisted of 70 priests and a high priest. Hyrcanus was the high priest. Galilee is this hotspot. Herod is able to take out Hezekiah, which is of incredible importance for the common people in Judea. Now, the Sanhedrin, who weren't really crazy about him, were absolutely convinced that he was going to be destroyed, right? That Herod was going to be destroyed. But that didn't happen. On the contrary, he comes out being a superhero in all of this. So now the Sanhedrin have to figure out a way, well, how can we discredit all of this? And you know what they do? They say, well, he wasn't very, very Jewish about this. He wasn't following the law. So the widows of Hezekiah and his band of robbers are kind of trumped up to appeal to the Sanhedrin that Herod exceeded his authority in killing these people without bringing them to trial, and giving them a fair trial. And this is the context in which Herod is brought back to Jerusalem. So I'm just going to stop there, because I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Sanhedrin now wanting Herod to come to stand on the carpet and give an accounting of himself, right? Any thoughts? Because if Herod had been found, go ahead, Mac.
And I had a thought that one of the things I thought in this book that was kind of always thrown out as a area of question was, just how Jewish was he? At points she makes it sound like he was really one of their kinsmen, and that was his homeland. I mean, he was a Galilean, and at other points, not so much. And it makes you wonder historically how he fit into that
Well, I'm reading another book in conjunction with this, and that question comes up. There are several historical incidents, in which Herod demonstrates his Jewishness. For example, when he goes to Rome to be declared king. Part of that ceremony would have included a tribute to see the emperor worship. Well, we seem to know that he did that. However, one of his big building projects was the temple, right? And he obviously had a hand in that. But the thing that is so interesting is that he was going to marry his sister, another one of these political marriages. Salome is her name. He was going to marry her to a Nabatean prince, creating an alliance there. But he would not allow the marriage to take place unless the prince converted to Judaism, which required that the prince be circumcised, right? Well, guess what? The prince refuses to do that, as you might imagine. So it's really kind of an open question, but I think what Hurston definitely wants to do is to paint Herod in the light of the kind of Jew you might find in Alexandria instead of Judea, a highly Greco-Roman, educated person who has been able to assimilate himself into the larger non-Jewish community. He studied in Damascus. He did not live a devout Jewish life, but there were Jews like him, Hellenized Jews, as we refer to them, definitely in Alexandria, Egypt, definitely in Babylon at this time, that were speaking Greek, that were enjoying their citizenship as Roman citizens, thank you very much, and seeing no conflict in that. And so Herod was probably one of those, which, by the way, Paul was one of those too, right? And I know there's another incident that I'm leaving out here that emphasizes that Herod, was not just a Jew in name only. He had a practice, a Jewish practice that he considered to be important, but it wasn't so important that it stifled his ambition. So, any thoughts on that, Mac, from your perspective?
No, I think that's about right.
Yeah. So anyway, we've got these trumped up charges. Herod is called back into Jerusalem, and this really begins his whole career as the man he would come to be known as, as being brash, as being bold, as being self-confident. Instead of wilting at the thought of being brought before the Sanhedrin, which had moral authority over him, right? He basically takes what he did and celebrates it, right? And he comes into Jerusalem and confronts the Sanhedrin, right? And they end up being utterly speechless. And as a result of that, there are some in the Sanhedrin who are going to say, you know what? The tide is changing. These weakling, religious leaders, represented perfectly by Hyrcanus II, who is seen as, this kind of milquetoast character who just kind of has no real leadership abilities, cries a lot, doesn't want to be high priest except for when it comes to dressing up and playing the role. There are some among the Sanhedrin, some Pharisees, who see the way that the wind is blowing, and they, after Herod has his consultation with the Sanhedrin. They go to dinner with him, right? And pretty much make it clear that they are in support of him as their new Jewish leader. And these people would come to be known in the time of Jesus as the Herodians. They were Jews who supported the Greek, the Hellenistic Jewish king Herod. And so that kind of sets up the circumstances into which Jesus was going to be born.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Constance.
would you explicate this piece of art for us?
Oh, this actually is, this was on a seal, and this is a colorized version. I should show you. Thank you. Herod, the other thing that made Herod Jewish is that the possibility came up for coins to be issued with his head on them. And he absolutely said no, because it was seen as a Jewish affront to God, to make a graven image. So we have no coins with Herod the Great's image on them, but we do have coins with Herod Agrippa, who would be Herod's grandchild, who would have no problem with his head being represented on a Roman coin. So, but I really don't know much about this picture, other than it appears on a seal. You can see the kind of rounded background there. There's a seal that I don't know much more about it than that, but he looks very Jewish in that. I'm going to show you some other images of him. This is a Roman, a marble bust. Herod's nose is broken off, and yet another one. So we don't have very many images of Herod whatsoever, which could lend credence to this idea of, he didn't want any images made of him. So can I come back to you on this one, Constance? And can I ask why you ask?
Oh, it's just such a strange face, like this
Yeah.
eye with this huge thing over it. It's not a symmetrical face at all.
Yeah.
It seems to be strange planes.
Yeah.
And it's
And
certainly not Herod
there's this
like
weird
that.
thing going on right here with the eye, if you can see that. But these were the only three images that I could find. This is a later image, right? This is one that, was probably from, the Middle Ages, when they were trying to represent Herod. But there are not many images of Herod whatsoever. But let's get to the fun stuff. Remember, after any questions about the, Herod's return to Jerusalem, where he is brought before the Sanhedrin, and they basically cower, and Herod comes out, victorious, and that was a watershed moment for not just Herod, but for biblical history, because it was pretty clear that the man in charge was going to be this young 25-year-old governor of Galilee, and the people rallied around him. They really rallied around him. And had there been any, concern about this, he would have had the support of the Galileans, who were their own force to be reckoned with. Some of you may know about a book called The Cotton Patch Gospel. Have you ever heard of this? Well, it was written by a African-American preacher, I think in the 1950s, and it was made into a play, but it takes place in Georgia, and Jesus, of course, is a tenant farmer, and of course, it takes place in Georgia in the 19th century, and the antebellum, or excuse me, in the post-Civil War South. And Jesus is represented as a Black, tenant farmer who begins preaching. And before you know it, they're all going to go to Atlanta. So he's down in like Columbus, Georgia, but he's got to take his preaching show to Atlanta, right? That difference between Atlanta, where all the aristocrats lived, and Columbus, Georgia, or wherever, down in the boonies, is very similar to what we have going on here. Jerusalem is the Atlanta, and Galilee is, the backwater. So for Jesus to come from Galilee is really quite extraordinary when you think about it. The fun stuff, marriage. Paula Fredrickson is known to have said at one time that court, the court intrigue was in Herod's day was a contact sport. That living as a royal in Herod's day was a contact sport. And what she means by this is that brothers were killing brothers, fathers killing sons, and Herod was right in the middle of this. Antipater, Herod's father, and it's almost like a soap opera. Antipater, and this, by the way, I've got this kind of laid out in that King Herod cheat sheet that I wrote up for you, and I will continue to add to that because I'm really having a good time with this. But Antipater knew that if Herod was going to, make inroads into Jerusalem, and perhaps be one of his successors, that he needed to be allied with the aristocrats of Jerusalem. So he marries Herod to a woman by the name of Doris. Doris, the name means a gift of God. She was the daughter of a Jewish aristocrat. And, it's about this time that Herod goes to Galilee that he has his first son. His first son is named after his father. So his first son's name is Antipater. But it wouldn't be long after this, for reasons that we're not entirely clear on, but basically Herod releases he divorces his wife and sends her off to Arabia with her son Antipater, so that Herod is able to marry a Hasmonean, a daughter of the line of the high priests. He is able to marry a Hasmonean princess by the name of Mariamna. Her name was probably Miriam, but translations over time have come out, and she's known historically now as a woman with the name Mariamna. She's a Hasmonean princess, so a marriage to her would legitimize him as a son of, because you marry into the family, as a son of the Hasmoneans and give him legitimacy as a descendant, right, of this long line of Hasmoneans who had ruled for the last 100 years or so. Mariamna is the granddaughter of Hyrcanus. She's the daughter of a woman by the name of Alexandra, who is going to play an amazingly intricate, what's the right word? Integral role in the court intrigues of the time. And from Mariamna, Herod would have two sons by the name of Antigonus and Aristobulus. He would also take into the court Mariamna's mother, Alexandra, who is the daughter of Hyrcanus II, who is in that long line of Hasmonean princesses. And part of the deal is that Mariamna has a slightly older brother by the name of Jonathan Aristobulus. There's a lot of Aristobuluses and Antigonuses in this, but this will give us an indication of how Herod plans to work. Jonathan Aristobulus was actually considered by many Jews to be the true heir to the Hasmonean throne. So Herod, however, doesn't want to see him, meddling in Herod's rise to power. So shortly after he marries Mariamna, Alexandra, who is Mariamna's mother and the mother of Jonathan Aristobulus, really pressures Herod to make Jonathan Aristobulus, the high priest. The kid is only 18 years old, though. Herod succumbs to that pressure, and in a great ceremony, Aristobulus is introduced in Jerusalem to a fanfare of acclaim. Apparently he was a very young, good-looking, tall kid that had all the features that you would expect of a good, Jewish leader. And it is reasoned, or it's speculated, that Herod was somewhat intimidated, or at least suspicious of how this might end up for him. So it's not long after this that Aristobulus, this high priest, dies mysteriously in a drowning accident in Jericho. He's only a high priest for about 2 months, but Herod is already, it's pretty clear that this was a very unusual event. A strong kid, strong swimmer, supposedly horsing around with his friends in, one of the pools in the palace at Jericho. And the friend kept, just accidentally kept him under the water for too long. Pretty clear what happened there, and pretty clear, what it was going to be like for the rest of Herod's reign. As we're going to find out, he's going to kill sons. He's going to kill his wife, Mariamna. He's going to kill Alexandra. He's going to kill Hyrcanus. The list just goes on. He was never a wilting flower when it came to, killing his opponents. But Mariamna would be executed shortly after their marriage, just a young woman, because Herod was suspicious that she was trying to take over his throne. Any questions about this strange, these strange family connections or comments? Now, according to Nicholas, both Mariamna and Jonathan were exceedingly beautiful and, represented what we might think of as, the star or teen idol of our day. And so Herod was always very, very suspicious, always paranoid. And that paranoia, unfortunately, was only, the flames were fanned by his sister Salome. In much of this, Salome is the one that's dropping a lot of hints about Mariamna on the first hand, and then Alexandra on the second hand, and then later on about her own niece, her own nephews, Antigonus, Herod's sons. She's always, kind of stirring the waters a little bit. So, her name is one of these names that's descended of the Hasmoneans as well. So Salome is a force to be reckoned with. There were some women that Herod had to reckon with in his court that were very, very important. Salome, Alexandra, and believe it or not, Cleopatra. Cleopatra of Alexandria in Egypt, right? Apparently Salome and Cleopatra, as well as Alexandra, were all very good friends and, wrote consistently to each other. And and Herod found this to be problematic as well. But there are names that are going to show up in the text. Salome, of course. Phasael is the older brother of Herod, who would later be, who was, named as procurator of Jerusalem. And then Joseph, who would soon be killed, and Pheroras. Pheroras is an interesting character who chose a slave to be his concubine, or his wife, really. And for all of Herod's murderous instincts, he was never able to bring himself to, put the knife to Pheroras. There was some special love that he had for this very, very younger brother of him. So, so I'm hoping that gives you kind of an idea of some of the characters we're dealing with in the story. Any more thoughts on this? Any thoughts? I know. What concerns me is that Constance Malloy said she had a hard time reading this book, and I know if
No.
Constance.
Wait.
Okay.
The very beginning, I had a hard time because there
Oh,
were so
okay.
many characters, and I really like that map you have. I'd love to have a copy of it because I was trying to figure out, okay, what time period is this and where are we going and so forth.
Oh, okay.
By the time I got about a quarter of the way through, I knew who everybody was and so forth.
Yeah.
And then I got situated and I
Yeah.
enjoyed it. It's very lively.
Yeah, very lively. Well, good. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to misrepresent you there, but it's complex. It really is. It's a tangled plate of spaghetti in terms of all of these people. The Romans, you've got the Hasmoneans, you've got the Nabateans who play a role in this, and Herod was right in the center of it. The reason I like this so much is because it gives us this wonderful facet of history that really precedes the writing of the Gospels. And influences the writing of those gospels in ways that we just do not acknowledge or understand at times. Mac, you were talking about this, the fact that the gospel writers were writing in Greek, but many of them considered themselves to be good Jews. How does that come about? And Herod was an example of someone who considered himself to be Jewish, but also, allied with the Romans in some ways. Hard to know where Jesus fell in all of this, Go ahead, Will.
Well, I like to think of it the way Denny has explained it
Yeah.
as the Godfather. You have to know who your enemies are,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, Denny?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Will, I'm thinking of that classic scene from The Godfather where Salvatore is exposed to be the mole within the family, La Familia. And he is being severely taken off to be garroted. And he makes the comment, just tell Michael it's all business.
Yeah. 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 It's really true.
It's only business.
It's only business. Yeah. And that's a good context of what we're talking about. There's so much murdering going on here. We haven't even talked about the Romans: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Octavian, all of the backstabbing. Literally, that's where we get the word backstabbing. All of that going on. We haven't even touched on that. Go ahead, Mac.
That's why I kind of feel sorry for Zora. She wrote this one about 1960. In
Yeah.
1934, Robert Graves publishes I, Claudius. And 40 years later, that's one of my favorite all-time public television series. Derek Jacobi and a young Derek and a young John Hurt. And it's the same thing. It's just like a big soap opera that goes on episode after episode. And this story to me is tailor-made for a treatment just like that. But she never got it. She never got it.
But I wonder if our context is such now that it would go now, I can't imagine that it would, given
Probably
the lack of biblical knowledge that many people have. I mean, back in the 50s when Cecil B. DeMille was writing, people were a little bit more serious about understanding the Bible, I think, but maybe I'm wrong. I didn't live at that time. I don't know. But also in all of this, I can't help but make the connection between Herod as a somewhat paranoid ruler. And let's just say some of the politicians that we have to, work around today. This whole kind of Roman melee of stabbing people and getting back at your enemies. Uh, you know,
Dan, Dan
Yeah.
is, in modern day context, is the modern Sanhedrin the United States Senate?
well, in this very, very specific context, you mean the ones not doing anything? I would say that's a pretty
A cowed.
cowed. Yeah, right. So yeah, I'd like to suggest, as as you continue to read on this, is that you make some of these connections, because we're seeing a lot of it, being recapitulated all in our very very context. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't really know how far. I think we've gotten to about page 100, and I really haven't. I've kind of assumed you were following the story as we go, but next time I'll get more narrative focused on this, and we'll just meet next Wednesday. I don't think I have a conflict then, unless somebody has a seizure or something.